How the ancient Greeks discovered free will. Most of us today live our lives in the understanding that we have free will. That is, that we are free to act according to our own choosing. But for a choice to be truly up to us means that we could have done otherwise in the exact same circumstances. But it is not clear if this is even possible. So the whole concept of free will might be just a form of superstition. And on top of this, we have reason to suspect that humans didn't always think this way. The ancients, of course, had words for choice, responsibility, coercion, freedom, deliberation, and so on. But if we look at the ancient texts, we often see that they believed that their choices were not made freely, but instead were whispered in by the gods. In the Iliot, for example, the story of the Trojan War, all important actions and decisions are acted out by earthlings. But, so we read, they are ultimately caused by the gods. When, for instance, a warrior gets energized for a fight, this is because a god entered into him and gave him that energy. And the gods also decide who will win the fight. Centuries later, Aristotle created a sophisticated theory on choice. But even he, the great philosopher, doesn't quite get to free will. Strangely, for Aristotle, a choice is not a matter of picking between alternatives, but instead a desire to follow through on a particular course of action, and this course of action is chosen by reason. And if someone knows, for instance, that a certain action is bad, but this person does it anyway, Aristotle then says that this person didn't choose to be bad, but instead that he acted against his own choice. The choice was not whatever the person decided to do, but instead whatever reason told him was best. Very curious indeed. But then finally, the Stoic philosopher and ex-slave Epictus developed both the concept of the will and also of free will. Our will, he said, allows us to consider various options, various alternatives, and then we accept some of them and we reject others. Much closer to our modern idea of a choice. And since an outsider cannot climb into our minds, we are in principle always free to control which thoughts we accept and which we do not. And then we have Alexander of Ephesus. He became the first to state that a choice is free if we could have chosen otherwise under identical circumstances, which is nearly identical to the modern superstition. If in a coin toss we pick heads, we believe that in exact the same circumstances we might as well have chosen tails. That is true freedom of choice. And finally, free will was adopted by Christianity, by Origen. He admitted that the concept was not in the Bible, but the concept did help him explain how evil could exist in a world made by a just and omnipotent God. Namely, because God gifted people free will, and with this they themselves chose to do evil. And a few centuries after, free will was adopted by the Church officially, which made it one of the pillars of Western thought. And again, although perhaps just a superstition, through Christianity it became a powerful motivator for progress in Western history, as it allowed people to fully take credit for their deeds. So, we have a lot to get to. Let's start. Hey, good to see you. This is Stephan, author of In Search of the Sublime. On this World History channel, we'll trace humanity's relentless pursuit of scientific truth, moral excellence, and enlightenment. You'll meet anyone from Mesopotamian astronomers and Indian yogis, to Greek philosophers and Enlightenment scientists. And you'll meet them firsthand using primary sources, giving you valuable insights that transcend the surface-level understanding you get on other channels. So go check it out for yourself. Let's start. We'll start around 750 BC, when a bard named Homer wrote the Iliot, the epic about Achilles and the Trojan War. In the Iliad, the oldest epic from Greece, we can find almost nothing resembling free will. The characters of the epic are never truly in charge of their own destiny, and this is because the gods always pull the strings behind the scenes. The gods start quarrels among men, they lead armies into battle, They plan the strategy of war for both sides. They give warriors the energy to fight and even decide who wins the war and when. All important events of the Iliad are described from the point of view of the struggling humans on Earth. But then the audience is also shown how the gods made these events happen. For instance, when a warrior survived the stabbing, we read that a god had made the weapon avoid his vital organs. And when Achilles was angry at his superior Agamemnon, it was a god who restrained him by the hair and warned him not to strike him. Interestingly, in the second epic of Greece, the Odyssey, the characters suddenly have a much greater sense of agency. This work is much less about the gods and more a celebration of the clever tricks concocted in the mind of the hero Odysseus. Although of course many gods feature in the story. Crucially, the first sentence of this text contains the word polytropon, which literally means much turning, referring to the flexibility of Odysseus' mind, that is, his great wit. And at some point we read, Odysseus even manages to deceive the goddess Athena by, quote, holding thoughts of great cunning in his mind. Over a century later, the Athenian politician Solon gave humanity even greater agency, warning his fellow Athenians not to blame the gods for their misfortunes, but themselves. And this level of personal responsibility was unthinkable in the time of the Iliad, some 150 years earlier. Now let's move another century ahead in time, to the philosophers Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates and Plato, who lived in the 5th century BC, also did not recognize free will. They instead recognized a type of wanting or desiring that we today no longer recognize. For they believed that reason itself can desire things. And this desire, they then claimed, is sufficient to motivate us to do things. Reason, they claimed, desires the good and then automatically compels us to act on it. But of course we can be mistaken about what we think is good. And this explained the existence of mistakes. Following his theory, Socrates concluded that, quote, no one does evil willingly. That is, we cannot act as humans against what we think is good. On top of this, they also recognized non-rational parts of the mind. For instance, we have appetites, such as hunger. And they added, if that desire of reason is not cultivated enough, then we might let our appetites take over, even when they shouldn't. And now we move to Aristotle, in the 4th century. Aristotle had a more nuanced view that is so close to free will that it is often interpreted that way by modern readers. For he speaks of deliberation, choice, and also of actions that we do, quote, of our own accord. But as we shall see, even he is not quite there. First of all, we'll focus how Aristotle updated Socrates' theory. He did this by giving a counterexample to Socrates' idea that we necessarily act on what we think is good. And for this he used the concept akrasia, or acting against our own best judgment. For instance, we might react quickly in anger, but we might have done differently if we were given enough time to think. Or we might generally believe that, say, smoking is bad, but we might temporarily forget about this in the moment that we're offered a cigarette, because then our appetites overwhelm us. According to the modern historian Frede, modern people can, quote, hardly help to interpret these cases as a mental conflict where the person chooses between reason and appetite, where we either choose to give in to our desire to smoke, or we listen to reason and choose not to smoke. But this is not what akrasia is. For in the examples given, reason is not acted upon because we didn't have the time to reason, or we forgot to reason. Never is there a deliberation about whether we reason or follow our appetites. And if we had the right reason at the right time, very similar to the cases of Socrates and Plato, we would follow it according to Aristotle. In fact, Aristotle says that if we give in to an appetite, that we act against our own choice, While we would today say that we would choose to act against reason. We know the cigarette is bad, but we'll do it anyway. And in this wording you can clearly see that Aristotle isn't talking about a choice between appetite and reason. For why else would he say that following our appetite means that we act against our choice? So acting against a rational belief simply isn't a choice for Aristotle at all, but instead a failure of restraining the appetites. So then you might wonder, what is Aristotle's definition of choice, or prohairesis in Greek? Well, it is the following. According to Aristotle, we sometimes have a goal in mind that we desire, and we then deliberate on how to get to that goal, and we deduce the best path through reason. Next, we form a desire to follow through on this path, and this desire, according to Aristotle, is our choice. That we desire a certain path based on reason. And then one last thing. We may also desire something that is unattainable. But in that case, of course, we cannot follow through on it. And as a result, Aristotle says that in that case it is not a choice, but just a desire. A choice, that is, has to be, quote, up to us. It has to be in our hands. So in sum, Aristotle says that a choice is, quote, a deliberate desire of things that are in our power. The word deliberate here points to the use of reason, and in our power means that it is up to us. And this, of course, is nothing like our modern definition of choice, that is to select between two or more alternatives. The selection in Aristotle is hidden in that deliberation, where we use reason to find the best path, while for him the choice itself is the desire to follow through on this best path. Very curious and quite difficult. On top of this, Aristotle also makes a distinction between things that we do hekontes, or of our own accord, and things that we do akontes, or not of our own accord. And this is usually translated as voluntary and involuntary. And this, of course, suggests free will. If we can do something voluntarily, it means we are free to do it. And by the way, this is already how the Roman philosopher Cicero translated it. But in Aristotle, the concept only distinguishes between actions for which we can be held responsible and not. And he concludes that we are not responsible when we are forced to do things, or when we act out of ignorance. For instance, if we have been lied to about something and act on that lie. But this problem of responsibility again has nothing to do with the free will to choose. One generation later, the atomist Epicurus attempted to work out what it means physically for something to be up to us, as Aristotle called it. Epicurus believed that the world was made of bouncing atoms, and most of the time, he claimed, these atoms moved by necessity, but sometimes they also, quote, swerve from their paths without cause. And without these random swerves, he reasoned, the world would be totally predetermined, which would mean in turn that none of our actions can truly be up to us. And this points to the problem of determinism that we will later associate with free will. Both the will and free will were finally introduced by Epictus in the 1st century AD. Epictus was a Greek philosopher of the Stoic school, and he developed the concept of the will, for which he used the Greek word prohairesis, the same word that Aristotle used for choice. Now this is what he believed. In principle, he said, we can cultivate our will, and when we do this, we can mentally accept or reject any thought. The will to him is that inner voice that helps us deliberate between various alternatives and then decide between them. Instead of believing that reason directly compels us to do something, in Epictetus' view, a person can consider various options and then he can give assent to the preferred option. And according to Epictetus, things are up to us precisely if we have that ability to give assent. And notice that this system gives much more agency to humanity. For now we can choose to give assent either to our appetites or our reason. It is as though a mental observer is placed above reason and appetites. Reason and appetites by themselves are no longer enough to explain why a person does a certain thing. But instead, it is this assent by the observer to give in to our reason or our appetite. And this is much closer to our modern thought. And now we come to the next step. As a former slave, Epictus thought a lot about freedom, and he realized that since no one can climb inside our mind, we have always, at least in principle, the freedom to accept or reject any thought, no matter our circumstances. We might not be able to act on every thought, but we can, in our own mind, accept or reject any thought. It is the only freedom that we can always count on, he said, as, quote, no thief can steal our will. Even a slave can in principle have this freedom. But, he added, it does require us to cultivate our will, because it might be difficult to do in tough circumstances. The modern conception of free will was formulated a century later by Alexander of Aphrodisias. According to Alexander, an action is performed freely if the actor could have chosen not to perform it under identical circumstances. For instance, before a coin flip, we might choose heads, but we might as well have chosen tails. That option, he believed, is completely up to us in otherwise identical circumstances. But this definition introduces a weakness into the concept that has pushed many modern scholars to drop the concept altogether. For is it even possible to make a pure choice, one not determined by our circumstances or our past? Does this not conflict with our deterministic scientific worldview that says that every action has a cause? But ironically, this unscientific view soon became one of the great superstitions of the West, and also likely one of its main driving forces. For the belief that man can take full credit of his own deeds and creations, and thus create a true legacy, can be a powerful motivator to achieve great things and to advance society. It might to some extent truly explain the Western enterprise. The concept of free will became mainstream when it was adopted by Christianity, which happened first in the work of the Christian scholar Origen. Origen admitted that the Bible made no reference to free will, but he nevertheless considered the concept helpful to understand the sacred text. For he claimed God had given mankind free will, allowing humans to have the free choice to do both good and bad, and this allowed him to explain how evil can exist in a world created by an omnipotent and just God. The concept was formally adopted by the Church in the 5th century AD, and then it quickly gained almost universal acceptance in the West. And by the way, it was also a Christian theologian, namely Tatian, who became the first to actually use the expression freedom of the will, eleutheria tes proharesios, if I pronounce that correctly. And thus unfolded the history of free will in the ancient world. I hope you were inspired and amazed by this lecture. And if you want to know more about Greek philosophy or any other topic from world history, then read my book In Search of the Sublime. You can read it completely for free on worldhistorybook.com, or you can buy a physical copy on Amazon. Thank you so much for watching. Bye bye.